Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome at this special seminar on the occasion of Milano Wine Week, and welcome very much on the part of Consorzio Vino Chianti, the organizer within this event of these activities focused on Chianti wine. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us. I'd like to bring the greetings of our president, who unfortunately cannot attend now, and I'd like to welcome you most of all to start this small walk journey in the Chianti area to learn better the specificities of a wine, the characteristics of a wine that is famous worldwide. Perhaps it's not so well known as it should be. And especially, there are some aspects and some differences that need to be better understood. My name is Luca Alves, and I am the event manager and the wine ambassador of the consortium. And I'm very lucky to be also the person who will accompany you by hand in this tour, in this journey in Chianti. We've decided to have a horizontal tasting of 2019 to underline these characteristics, these special characteristics of the subzones of Chianti, which, as you probably know, are 7. Before starting, before tasting the wines, of course, when we talk about Chianti wine, we have to talk about the history of this wine and the history of the area in general. And of course, many of you are professionals and are very well aware, but perhaps I can refresh your memory. And so I've prepared a very short presentation, which I'll share live. I think I know that this seminar is live with other countries. We have 3 towns in the States, Miami, Chicago, and New York. And then we have Toronto from Canada, we have London, and then we have the center of this event, which is Milan. So, of course, the slides will be in English, even though I'll continue my seminar in Italian, because it's easier for all of us. And I'd like to start you from the very beginning. Please feel free to ask any questions. So if you have opinions or questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So we want to be interactive. That's our style at the Consorzio. We want to know your opinion. We want to have your feedback. We want to know whether you have questions, of course. So don't be shy. And interrupt me whenever you like if you need to know more details in relation to what I'm about to say. Chianti, as I said, is a very traditional wine, an historical wine, I would say. And to talk about Chianti wine, of course, we have to talk about the history of Tuscany, of wine in Tuscany that is very, very, very old. But we have to say that the wine, at least the way we know it today, of course, has gone through very eras. And let's say that the beginning of winemaking, actually, as you probably know, was something that we imported, so to speak, from a very advanced Mediterranean civilization, being the Greeks. In those days, Greeks were also migrants. Not because of famine or poverty, but often they were noble migrants. That is to say, they were traveling to export what they had, to trade, and to know the world. And among the many things that they brought over to Italy, first in southern Italy and then up north, there was also viticulture. And if you think of Magna Graecia, so if you think that Ischia was the first Greek colony outside Greece, you can easily understand that these cultures then intertwined. In Tuscany, which was not yet called Tuscany in those days, it was called Etruria, there were the Etruscans, a very refined, sophisticated civilization, which then in the end clashed with Greek civilization and also adopted the wine culture of Greece. Of course, Greek wine was pretty rudimentary, and the Etruscans made it evolve and improve it and started the so-called specializations. In those days, vines were kind of wild, and we were talking about viti labrusche, so these big trees, and later on maybe I'll show you some pictures. There are some mosaics. So these large trees with many little men that were climbing up to harvest the grapes, and this was just a realistic representation of what was happening, because of course this was the way that they were harvesting grapes. So Etruscans started to experiment and to integrate wine into their social activities and also their religious rituals. And so wine became an element very much related to their habits and traditions. Unfortunately, the Etruscan civilizations was pretty short, and so the Etruscans were replaced by the Romans. The Romans had a slightly different attitude compared to Etruscans. They were a little less philosophers, little less sophisticated, but very practical. And so much so that viticulture, at least the way we know it today, so with rows of wines and vineyards, date back to those days. So the Romans decided to organize actually real farms with a specific purpose, which wasn't just pleasure and conviviality, but trade. So they were traders. They were already trading across the Mediterranean Sea, and so wine became a product, a very important product that was traded. And this is important to outline because wine became not just a kind of abstract object, but something that had to consist with specific requirements in terms of aging, in terms of grapes, and therefore the Romans then added these very practical, let's say, aspects that did very good to the viticulture. We know it the way we know it today. Here are some images where we see the harvesting and also crushing of grapes. So they were already pretty well organized in those days. Then the Romans did this, and if you ever read any treatise, Roman treatise, they had you may have read about their production, so like winemaking technique, which was already very well codified. So they already had technique, winemaking techniques. For instance, the Rustica by Columella is a treatise on, for instance, aging of wines, how they had to be blended, and all those sophistications which would be unacceptable today, of course, like they were using resins and chalk and rose petals. So because wine was a sort of magical substance. In any case, let's come quickly to a very crucial turning point, the Middle Ages. Of course, in the first part of the Middle Ages, the situation was pretty tough, but it was also very important for winemaking because so there were these dark years and dark ages, but one very important groups of people defended the wines, monks. So wine was already used during the Mass in religious rituals, so wine was necessary. And so monks, in particular Benedictine monks and Vallombrosa monks, and the Vallombrosa monks are in a very special order in Tuscany, were the custodians of viticulture, so they kept making wine. And we have to remember that in those days it wasn't easy to pass the notions about agronomy and viticulture and so on. In any case, they protected and they saved the Tuscany enology in its infancy. Then later on, we come to what we know as the Renaissance. The Renaissance in this period, everything was flourishing: culture, architecture, arts in general, food, and of course also wine. Wines became extremely important. And of course, this was, of course, supported, of course, by what the many artists were doing, but mostly by the Medici family, who were bankers and landowners. So they were a very powerful family. Somehow made wine become a product that wasn't just a prestigious product, but also a wine that was a political status symbol. So being a connoisseur wasn't just something, or talking about wine wasn't just something that you would discuss around the table, but wine was also a symbol of power. And for instance, this can be seen very well if you have ever visited the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, in the courtyard before going into inner halls. So the pillars, there are some pillars with grapes and vine leaves. And this shows this correlation between this element of power and this element of social pleasure. And wine was so deeply rooted in the society that all social classes drank it. Of course, the richest had the best wines, but they all had wine on their tables. And for instance, in this slide, there was a very important category that was protected. So that is the category of wine makers and wine dealers. So in those days, there was the first classification of the artisans, so minor arts and major arts. And so among minor arts, there was also the art of wine. So wine tenders, so people who were managing bars and inns. And this, with this, we have the beginning of the so-called denominations of origin. And actually, a little later in the 1700s, or better, sorry, let me make a step backward. Let's check where we stand with Chianti. So what was Chianti in those days? First of all, the word Chianti, that doesn't have a very clear etymology, very clear origin. So there are many ideas about that, but that's still unclear. So the name Chianti started to be associated with red wine only in the 1600s. Earlier on, in the 1400s, 1500s, wine that was similar to Chianti was actually a white wine. Then they started to talk about vino vermiglio. Vermiglio in Italian is it the Italian for dark red? And then this became the Chianti wine. Then in the 1700s, another very important protagonist, Cosimo III of the family Medici, wrote the first regulation about winemaking, and it's called Bando Medicio. And in this document, Cosimo de' Medici wrote not only, and by the way, Cosimo de' Medici was a gourmand, a gastronome, today a connoisseur, so very knowledgeable about food and wine. So he underlined the denominations, or better, the products that were already well known in those days, and identified four in particular, and of course, one of them is Chianti wine. And in addition to this, he underlined what were the winemaking areas. But he did something more, something very unusual and very interesting, at least for us, looking backward. So the entire regulation, and there were also sanctions related to any counterfeiting of wine. So already in those days, these wines were so famous, so well known, that there were some people who already tried to counterfeit these wines and then trade them. And so Medici identified very strong sanctions four counterfeiters, and there were also some inspection authorities. So we see some inspectors like we have today in the DOCG and DOC areas. Then, if we move forward in time, well, the history of Chianti was marked by very important man, and at the end of the 1800s, we have this austere man. We have Barone Bettino Ricasoli. Barone Bettino Ricasoli was said to be the Iron Baron because he was a very tough man. And he was also a great winemaker and a great farmer, so much so that he even became a Ministry for Agriculture. So he was making wine in the Castle of Broglio, close to Siena, and he was sort of obsessed, literally obsessed by Sangiovese. Sangiovese in those days, of course, wasn't the same as today. Certainly, you know that in viticulture and in agronomy, there are adaptations and adjustments and clonations and selections and so on. But in those days, the notion of viticulture and of enology was still pretty primitive, despite it was progressing. So in any case, he was so obsessed, let me use this term, because actually Ricasoli also wrote many letters and treatises and documents that actually, and he would, and he said that actually he was so keen on his Chianti, and he underlined a detail, very important detail, and he was saying that this wine is angular, and he was saying that he couldn't yet manage this kind of bitterish, greenish element in his Sangiovese that he couldn't get rid of. And then he started many tests and experiments, also chemical tests. And this is a great innovation because chemistry in wine started in those days, so much so that he collaborated with another illustrious professor, Professor Studiati from the University of Pisa, who was considered like a guru of wine chemistry. And therefore, they investigated not only the sensory elements, but also the empirical elements, and therefore to discover why this wine wasn't yet a wine that was as at the level of French wines, since he traveled a lot to France too. And after 20 years of experiments and also some very folkloristic tests, for instance, he shipped his wines across the world by boat mainly, and he shipped all over the world for people to test its durability. And of course, wine was shipped by boat. There weren't temperature controlled cells, and these wines were very susceptible to very quick deterioration. So much so that in those days, the most popular wines that were exported were the wines from Jerez in southern Spain or Porto, because they were fortified and therefore they could withstand long journeys. Of course, France had very long-lasting wines, top quality wines, but Chianti was still finding it hard to get to that level of quality. But after 20 years of experiments, Barone Ricasoli wrote what was considered the modern formula of Chianti. As you can see here, so he underlined, this is an extract from a letter that he sent to Professor Studiati, where he underlined the doses. So most of the grapes should be Sangiovese. In those days, it was called Sangioveto, that lends most of the structure, the flavors, and aromas to Chianti. Then a portion of Cannaiolo, red Cannaiolo. Even though Cannaiolo can also be white, but this was red, and then a portion of Malvasia. In this case, it was written Malvagia, that's the ancient name. That so Cannaiolo was smoothing and dampening the angular character of Sangiovese, and Malvasia was kind of sweetening with its natural sugar residues so as to achieve a nice balance. This was 1872. This was the first blend that then made history and that has become the structure and DNA of what we call Chianti wine. And then we then arrive in the 1900s. 1927 is the year when our consortium was founded with the purpose of protecting and promoting and representing Chianti wine, which was already very well known in those days. And when did we have a turning point? When did Chianti started to become very much exported and so very well known? Well, between the 1800s and the 1900s, for a lucky combination. You know that in those days, the whole of Europe was struck by phylloxera, and therefore the European vineyards were totally destroyed. But Tuscany was very lucky because phylloxera descended very slowly from north to south and arrived some 10, 15 years later to Italy and to Chianti. And wines in those days, as I said, were exported mainly from France, so the great Bordeaux wines. So demand was growing. There was a lot of immigration. There were Italo-Americans, Italo-South American, and so this increase in wine demand helped the Chianti wine that experienced a very important, let's say, boom, a very important success. And as a result, this became the first Italian red wine exported in the world. So exported through in the typical flask, our fiasco, our flask that could be found on the tables of Italo-Americans and South Americans. So the icon, the symbol of Chianti wine meant as a great Italian wine dates back to those days. Then if we move forward in time, and then we'll start to taste some wines finally, we'll get to the most recent years, because after that bright initial moment, also Chianti was affected by phylloxera, and then this was the time of a big crisis, and also let's say around the 50s and 60s, when the industry got stronger. People, especially young people, left the countryside and went to big cities to work in factories, and so young people decided to leave and so go to town and abandon then the countryside, and then therefore these two crises, the phylloxera and the let's say the crisis to industrialization in the end merged. And then Chianti was already subdivided into subzones, because 6 out of our 7 subzones date back to 1932, as you can tell from this map. In 67, Chianti finally became a DOC, and in 84, Chianti finally is the one we know it today, so it becomes a DOCG, denominazione di origine controllata e garantita. And little by little, Chianti started to gain ground and also managed to change the notion of viticulture. These are the years of super Tuscans, so great wines that until recently were only made to make big quantities. So until the beginning of the 80s, Chianti was just made in big quantities, so quality was not so special. So a lot of quantity and cheap prices. And this was a dogma of Italian viticulture, except for a few cases. Then Chianti decided to change its skin, so to speak, because it started to be exported. And by the way, remember that today in Chianti, 100 million bottles a year are made. So that's a remarkable number. And about 70% of these bottles are exported across the world on average. And therefore, it's impossible not to consider the demands and the requests of the importing countries. And therefore, those were the years of Tuber Tuscans. And so, for instance, we have Tiganello and then Sassicaia. So before the new denominations, which are pretty recent, there was this need also because the palate of consumers in these countries had changed, and consumers preferred full-bodied, oaky wines, intense, long-lasting, lingering, and until those days we would keep Chianti in large barrels, chestnut of chestnut wood, which is not very good for aging red wine, and also the vineyards were organized in such a way to make a lot of quantity instead of quality. But then things changed. So I think we can start from a short overview. These are the subzone. In any case, you can find them also on your tables. And so here are our subzones. So this area highlighted here is around 16,000 hectares. So that's a remarkable area that covers about 60% of the area under vine in Tuscany. You see the different colors that correspond to the subzones. As I said, there are 7, like the wines we are going to taste, one from each subzone, and refer to 6 provinces. In the area of Florence, we have Chianti Colli Fiorentini, but we also have 2 additional important subzones, such as Chianti Rufina, that is the most northernmost, then Chianti Montespertoli, which is the 7th of our subzones added in 97. And then we also find a part with Chianti Montalbano, which is a subzone shared by 2 provinces, actually 3 provinces, Firenze, Prato, and Pistoia. Then down south we have Chianti Colli Aretini, with Arezzo as main town, then Chianti Colli Senesi, of course, with the city and province of Siena, then Chianti Colline Pisane, closer to the coast. And I think this is all. I think I haven't forgotten anyone. So today, Chianti, as I said, is very much related to these cultural towns and these provinces of Tuscany that I mentioned: Arezzo, Florence, Pisa, Pistoia, Prato, and Siena. So what is Chianti today in terms of territory? Well, the territory, we can say, that has a continental climate, sub-humid climate. Main rainfall is in November. The warmest month is August, and the temperatures can go down with peaks, and we also have frost. For instance, if you haven't visited Chianti, here you have a couple of pictures. Then from the technical standpoint, the vineyards have to comply with certain rules. So these vineyards have to be in between certain altitudes. Maximum altitude is 700 meters. There are some vineyards high up at that altitude. And then also another important element is the plants per hectare, 4,100 plants per hectare. And this is very important to underline because in the past this density was much lower, and this was one of the reasons why this wine didn't achieve great intensity and great structure. But we'll discuss later on about this. Then we have the training methods, training systems, which are the Guyot, and then there are pergolas cannot be used. And then we have the yields. The yields are extremely important. This is very important in modern viticulture. And the yield today is 110 quintals per hectare for Chianti and 95 quintals for the so-called Chianti Superiore. Oh, sorry, for some sub-zone 95, and then 90 quintals for the so-called Chianti Superiore. Then the blend, 70, minimum 70% of Sangiovese, even 100%, as we will often have in our glasses. And then we can add additional grapes from different varieties. Oftentimes, these are indigenous varieties such as Canaiolo, Colorino, Mammolo, Malvasia Nera. And sometimes, even though this is not, less common and can be just up to 50%, also other varieties such as Cabernet or Merlot or Syrah. And then another interesting element is that in Chianti nowadays, it is still possible to have up to 10% of white wines, generally Trebbiano and Malvasia. And this dates back to the Barone Ricasoli, who used the Malvasia in those days to dampen and sweeten and smooth the angular character of Sangiovese. Here are the categories, even though we will drink Chianti di Annata. What is Chianti di Annata? Chianti di Annata can be marketed from the next March, after the harvest. And some subzones have even more strict restrictions for Chianti di Annata, so this vintage Chianti. And starting from 1st March of the year following the harvest, you can have Chianti, Chianti Colli Aretini, Chianti Colli Senesi, Chianti Colli Pisani, and Montalbano. Then from 1st of June, Chianti Montesperli, and from 1st of September, Chianti Colli Fiorentini and Chianti Rufina. And then at this moment in time, there's another category of Chianti wine, which is Chianti Superiore, that can only be released from 1st September of the following year. Then we have Chianti Riserva, which by law will have to be aged at least for 24 months before being released on the market. And so substantially Chianti categories, so except for some subzones, are three: Chianti di Annata, Chianti Superiore, and Chianti Riserva. And there is one more actually, which is not a DOCG, but a DOC, which is Vin Santo del Chianti DOC, which we are not going to taste, but is still part of the Chianti denomination. And therefore, it's also protected by our consortium. So we will taste the Chianti di Annata, so a wine that can be released from the following March after the harvest. So it's a young wine. And in any case, this minimum period of time is often exceeded in the sense that it's difficult that winemakers put this product on the market so early. Also because these wines have a very good aging potential, but actually we can have this wine also at a very early moment. Needless for me to underline the characteristics of Chianti di Annata, because we are going to taste it together. And actually, I would like you to help me in this. But of course, Chianti di Annata is a sort of passepartout. It's Chianti par excellence that pairs with anything. It's very versatile and fresh, medium-bodied wine. So it's a real prototype of the wine that somehow with which you cannot make mistakes in the end. So let's now taste our wines. So let me move over here so that I don't cover the slides. Let me see if I manage to pull all the glasses without causing any damage. Here we are. So as I said earlier on, we have a beautiful battery of 7 wines, so as many as the Chianti subzones. And on your table here on your mat, you have the map, and also you have it in the technical data sheet so that you can see, you can locate the wines. Let me make a short introduction. So none of these names as the name of the winery. So it's not a real blind tasting, but it's almost a blind tasting. And this is something that we did on purpose. And this is something we often do at the consortium, because at the consortium, we protect over 3,000 winemakers, so we have many members, and so presenting one wine instead of another might indirectly be a sort of advertisement for some winemakers and not others. But it's, the consortium is like the father of 3,000 children, and so there cannot be any preferences. So this is the first key element that makes us always organize blind tastings. And then the second reason is a technical reason. We find it much more interesting to taste wines without knowing the winery. Then if you like, you will have a chance to see the bottles and, of course, see the producers, not to influence you, not to bias you, and so that because you don't know the label. And then this is an horizontal tasting. So even though these are not all, exactly identical wines, so some got oak, others don't, but just to make you understand that the versatility and the flexibility of a variety like Sangiovese. Sangiovese is a variety which is very, I like to say, plastic, so very versatile, that can be grown in different microclimates and soils, but it can also give very different results. So unlike other varieties, even perhaps even maybe better known, Sangiovese tends to be rather voluble. And so here we see wines made with Sangiovese, 100% of Sangiovese, that are equivalent, so same amount of Sangiovese with very different notes. And this is important to underline because Sangiovese has this variability. And this is why I say that Chianti is very well known, but actually it can be very diverse, because you think you know what it is, but then when you taste many different Chiantis, you discover many differences that are not generally described. So let's start from wine number 1 from Sottozona Montalbano. So let me stand up so that you can see the slides. So Chianti Montalbano, the subzone, is the one of the highest area in the mountains, because we have the Apennine Ridge. You know, the Apennine embraces like a half moon the whole of Tuscany, and more on this area with Rufina, but also the part of Montalbano, and actually Montalbano, so Monte is mountain in Italian. So it's a mountainous area. So here we are in the village next to Carmignano in the area of Prato. And this is a blend with a prevalence of Sangiovese, 90%, and there is 10% of Canaiolo and Colorino, so very indigenous traditional varieties. This is a wine that is not aged in oak barrels. It is only kept in stainless steel vats, and therefore this has to be intended as a fresh wine. Before tasting the wine, I'd like to say that so I don't like to replace your palate, let's say. Therefore, your opinion is always respected. I mean, I just would like to give you information, so some information about the key characteristics of Sangiovese, even though I'm sure you know it very well already. Then all the other shades and all the other aspects, well, I would like that you capture them on your own. Of course, let's start from the color. This is called a ruby red. It's a ruby red, which is pretty delicate and pale. It's almost always bright, but it has a very specific distinctive feature. That is to say, it's translucent. Translucent because you can see through the glass. So it's pretty easy to see through the glass. So it's pretty transparent, translucent. And if you find a very dark Sangiovese or thick Sangiovese, maybe it's not just only Sangiovese. And so let's taste it. And let's see on the nose, let's see what is the ID card of the young Chianti di Annata. First of all, the floral notes. So this delicate bouquet of fresh flowers. And often we have the so-called mamola, which is a sort of violet, fresh, with a very nice scent. So pretty delicate on the nose. And then often, I think also in this case, into floral notes, we have some small details like rose petals, but in any case, I would say, all in all, delicate, fresh flowers. As to the fruity part, this is also pretty typical. And we have mainly red fruits, red berries, never too ripen, let's say cherry, let's say also plum, strawberry, and sometimes even smaller fruits like gooseberry, but always, crispy but still a little unripened fruits, like when we pick cherries when they are still unripe. Um, so it's still a bit crunchy and a bit more harsh. On the palate, the body is pretty slim, so medium body, delicate, very fragrant, and very crunchy and explosive. This fruit, uh, kind of pulpy fruit, juicy fruit, um, blends with the true business card of Sangiovese, that is to say, acidity. So the key word that you always have to associate with Sangiovese. Sangiovese also has this cleaning capacity, ability, that, I mean, it has a medium structure. I mean, it's never too structured or intense. So it would be a medium weight. So energetic but slender and slim and agile, but always with this nice acidity, which is cleaning the mouth very well. That is drying the mouth very well. That is typical of Sangiovese. There is also a very nice tannin texture, so that's a young wine not kept in oak barrels. And the intention of the winemaker is to make a very fruity, very enjoyable, easy drinking wine. And this is a wine that can be served fresh and generally never disappoint you. Let's now move to the second wine, if you have no questions, of course. And let's move over to another subzone. There's a question. Well, in any case, the lady was asking about the difference between this subzone and the others. And actually, we have to wait and first taste all the wines. Because, you know, the notion of subzones is so doesn't match the notion of subzones of back in 1932, because you know today winemakers are very intimistic in the sense that their trademark and their signature is very important today. And also, the Chianti territory is very heterogeneous, very diverse in terms of soils and altitudes and exposures and also composition of the soil. So this means that inside each subzone, for instance, in the past we would say, well, this is a Chianti Colli Fiorentini, and so it has to be this way. This is Chianti Rufina, and it has to be that way. But it is no longer so. Also because in each subzone there is a lot of diversity. So I mean, you can have neighboring wineries that have different soils and results that can be very different. And there is another additional element, the clone, so clones with which wine is made. So in the past, the production was just very simple, and I mean you would harvest wine from a certain date on, and that's it. But some Sangiovese did not yet had its complete phenolic maturation, whereas today we make a Sangiovese or a Chianti with a natural acidity, and this is very different from the green acidity of those wines of the past. So, of course, if you uncork a bottle in 50 years, you have a green acidity, but that's a completely different story. So it would not give us this strong body and this citric sensation. All this to say that, especially from the 80s and also in the 90s, in the vineyards, winemakers learned to listen to the vines and interpret them, and did so also agronomically to a very large extent. For instance, in the past, vineyards were promiscuous. There were different varieties in the same vineyards, Sangiovese, Calorino, they were all mixed up. Whereas what we today, so what we call a field blend, so a natural blend, already started from the vineyard, and all the grapes were harvested together. And so the result was a balance that was already decided in the vineyard. Whereas now we have specialized vineyards. And most of all, we have vineyards with a very different intensity and with the so-called mass selection. What is mass selection? Mass selection means that before replanting a vineyard, the winemaker makes a selection of plants and picks the best ones so that the new vineyard reflects the best DNA of the vineyard. And this was done from the 1980s onwards. And so those vineyards were very different. So this is already another difference. For instance, the vineyards of those days have nothing to do with what it is today. For instance, in the past, there were 2,000 vines per hectare. There were 2 meters apart, whereas vineyards now are much more dense, 5,000, 6,000 vines per hectare. And the plants, the vines are much lower and much closer together, because the competitiveness between vines is regarded as a very important element for quality. So the closer these vines there are, the more they will extract from the soil more content. And also production is less. So the yield per hectare, the yield per vine is less. So it's more concentrated. In any case, I don't want to dwell too much on this aspect. In any case, for various reasons, today it's not very easy to identify one subzone from another. True, there are some key elements. For instance, for Montalbano, we have a floral Chianti, and it's easy drinking. So these are gentle wines from Montalbano that are released pretty early on the market, and they can be very good vini di annata. But we cannot just associate a feature, a characteristic with each subzone, because maybe there are other wines that are very similar to Montalbano wines, but they are made somewhere else. And certainly Sangiovese, well, it also depends on how it is planted. We will see that while we discuss the next wines, so that we can see more the difference. But it's very dangerous even today to talk about the identity of the individual subzone. So it's easier, or better, it's more appropriate to talk about the identity of the producer, of the winemaker, and the interpretation of the winery, rather than discussing about the individual subzone. The second wine is a Chianti Colli Fiorentini. Perhaps you can show me the slide. Still, of course, to oh, sorry. The second wine, Chianti Colli Fiorentini. Of course, we are in the province of Florence. So we still have a blend, Sangiovese Colorino. Oh, sorry, there's a mistake here. The blend is not Sangiovese Carmelo, but it's a Sangiovese Canaiolo. So 90% Sangiovese and 10% Canaiolo. There's a mistake on the slide, I'm sorry. So the soil here has a lot of pebbles, so river pebbles, and this, and also the altitude. I'm sorry, there are a few mistakes. The altitude is not 400 but 250, and this Sangiovese is pretty soft and gentle. And this example of Sangiovese di Annata is again not kept in oak but in stainless steel and cement vats. I'm sure you know how these concrete, these cement vats are. They micro-oxygenate the wines, also older wines, in a way that is not very aggressive. So cement, unlike stainless steel, lets the oxygen go through, even though very slowly, and this is makes the wine pretty soft. Then we have this ruby red color. So if you take a look at the glasses, the color is very similar. So always bright ruby red, a truly ruby stone. So in Italian we say rubino, ruby. And on the nose, it's a little darker. So this fruit is more ripened. This fruit is more round. Yes, we have cherry, yes, but more ripened than the earlier cherries. Then the floral notes are less evident than in the initial one. The first one was more fine. This second wine is more juicy, and it's has a very a more intense nose. And on the palate, it is a little fuller than the previous one, and probably also more round. The first one was more crispy, more crunchy. And of course, this wine too has nice acidity, but this acidity is more balanced towards the more sweet aspects. So it's not angular, it's very smooth, easy to drink, and has also, it's very lingering, good persistence, even though it's a slender, easy to drink wine. So these soils that I said earlier on, so the pebbles, these river pebbles, which is typical of the area of Florence, province San Cacciano, Monte Spertoli, Valmantile. So these are nothing but stratifications. I mean, earlier on there was the sea, and then there were some rivers, and so this roundness is the result of these pebbles. And so these pebbles are pretty round, and we have round wines, round and gentle wine since the very beginning. So, and let's continue, if there are no questions, with wine number 3, and we move over to another subzone. Now we are Chianti Colline Pisane 2019. And Colline Pisane is between parentheses. And this was done because in the subzones, it is, of course, possible to make the so-called Chianti Generico, so just generic Chianti. And some winemakers, for marketing reasons, prefer not to underline the subzone. And this is often the case of Colline Pisane. So this Chianti has the characteristic of Colline Pisane, but without declaring that in the label, and then you will also see that on the bottle. So in this case, the blend is slightly more dynamic, and here we have 90% Sangiovese. You know that the minimum is 70. And then there are these so-called international varieties, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Syrah, even though the amount is very small, just 5%. And let's see how this element is impacting the wine. First of all, the altitude is pretty low, 200 meters, and the vineyards are almost overlooking the coast. Actually, they're not on the sea, but they are influenced by these mild climate of the coast. So these hills are more sweet and round in the area of Volterra, if you ever were there, compared to the hills in the province of Arezzo and Florence, which are more rocky, whereas here there is a lot of sand and a lot of fossils. And if you break the soil, you'll find the shells. And so this testifies to the fact that many millions of years ago, there was the sea in this area. So if you smell this wine, you perceive notes that are very different. For instance, I've noticed pepper, green, that we can find in this Cabernet. So these spicy notes. And on the nose, it seems more Mediterranean wine, so slightly balsamic and a bit more intense. And on the palate, it's warmer. We have a good, nice, warm finish. And then there is a different sweet note, so the acidity is very balanced, but this wine is more juicy. And so this fruit is more gluten. And so this note is no more a note of acidity, but it's more sugary. And so I say gluten. So let's continue with the fourth wine. So now we move from the sea breeze to the winds of the higher hills. So we are in the typical postcards of Tuscany, close to San Gimignano, close to Siena. So in the very characteristic area of the hills in Siena. And for the first time in these four wines, we have 100% Sangiovese. So it's not marked here, but it's 100% Sangiovese from a single vineyard. So like we could say a cru. And in this case, also the previous wine is not kept in oak. It's always kept in cement and stainless steel vat. So they were not exposed to oak. Whereas in this case, we start to have the use of large barrels and then the micro-oxygenation. So as I said, 100% Sangiovese, soil is different. Here we have clay mostly, and also sand, quite a lot of sand that is also due to these areas, as I said. So it's incredible that it's as if you go to these vineyards and you can find all these signs and marks of the previous ages. And so you can still find some shells. This is higher up, 350 meters of altitude than the Guyo training system. And then here we have a vineyard that is much older, 30 years. And the aging, so this is aged in Slavonian oak casks. So let's see what this means for this wine. We still have this bright red. And the nose is a bit more sophisticated. So this fruit is no more muscular, but is a bit wiser, let's say, calmer. And that requires a little more understanding, so it's not easy to understand immediately, so it takes a while. Then on the palate, it's has a very traditional personality. In this case, I mean, the use of oak is very delicate, so you don't perceive much the oak. So it was used very wisely. But you perceive this in the dryness and in the tannin texture. So the texture of this wine is not only given by the pulp, but is also because of this oak aging. But this was a smart use of oak, because when you don't perceive this oak too much, it means that it was made very well. So then the next wines are a bit more muscular, still with oak. And this is perhaps a watershed between a fresh wine, fruity wine, like the initial wines, the first wines, and then a more selected, more sophisticated wine. So, and now wine number 5. Chianti Montespertoli 2019. Montespertoli is the most recent subzone added in 1997. And we have again Sangiovese, 100% Sangiovese. So it's not a blend, but just Sangiovese. So Montespertoli is a very nice area, and this is the area with more vineyards of all of Tuscany. And the soil is pretty heterogeneous, pretty diverse. In this area, we have quite a lot of clay and medium texture soils, and these wines tend to be pretty energetic and muscular. So let's see this wine that was also kept in barrique, so smaller barrel. So even though it's a second and third passage barrique, and let's see the impact of this. Well, the nose is even more evolved compared to the previous wine. And it's pretty intense and balsamic on the nose. So you perceive these balsamic notes, typical of Sangiovese. The fruit is very full and dense in terms of tannins, very compact, very concentrated. So this is a wine that starts to have muscles. And the acidity we had in the first wines is still there in the background, but it's not prevalent. So this is a wine that actually tends to be more muscular compared to the previous wines. Then the fruit is definitely ripened fruit, dark fruit, also berries, forest berries, so more ripened fruit, even though they still have some acidity. But still, this is a wine that in any case, in terms of pairings, can certainly give a lot of satisfaction, because these wines can, I mean, are not too demanding. They can be paired pretty well with very different dishes. And now Chianti Colli Aretini. And still 100% Sangiovese. And the texture of the soils is similar to Montespertoli. The altitude is pretty remarkable, 450 meters. And also this winery is pretty close to the mountains, so the Apennines behind Arezzo. And so let's see how this translated into these, the presence of these mountains in this Sangiovese. The color has become a little darker. So this ruby red is darker. And this is just a tiny detail though, tiny nuance. But you can see that there is a different approach. Of course, this wine too was kept in oak. And so also, of course, the color, the pigments are released in a different way. And the nose too is pretty intense, so the aroma is a penetrating aroma. Again, balsamic notes, because when we breathe in this bouquet, we have a pretty impactful and powerful sensation. And also here you can notice the ripened fruits, between red and black fruits, similar to the previous wine. And please notice also the influence of oak. So we have some vanilla notes, but very, very mild and delicate. So this is typical of the use of oak. Yet again, it's full on the palate. Perhaps it's more distended than the previous one, but very persistent. Still a medium body wine, but as I'm speaking, I still perceive this sensation with more acidity than the previous wine. So it's a bit more perhaps angular and rustic, but very juicy. And the mouth volume is completely different. So this sensation of delicacy, of slenderness of the first wines is here replaced by a more multi-layered structure. The oak is very well integrated, but you perceive that there's oak. So I would say it's a nice wine. Very pleasant wine. Oh, very well. Let's close with our journey in Chianti with wine number 7, which is Chianti Rufina. And among the subzones, in the past it was the smallest. Now it's Montesperti, the smallest. Certainly it's the higher up on the mountains, is to the northeast of Florence, in an area which is hilly area, very with high hills. And here we have another blend, Sangiovese 80%, sorry, 90%. Then Canaiolo and Ciligiolo. There is another indigenous variety, even though less typical of our area. It's more typical of southern Tuscany, but sometimes it's used also in Chianti. And then the soil is with a lot of galestrum or silt and clay. So it's a powerful soil that generally makes wines that require a bit more time to express themselves and that are a bit more energetic. And so we can say that Rufina, so in general, in the Rufina area, we obtain wines with a higher average acidity. So this means that in general, it takes a little longer. It takes a little longer to achieve the right balance. And actually, Rufina is an area where we often have aged wines. So these are wines with a aging potential. And so we have had very nice Chianti Rufina vertical tastings with wines from decades ago, and they still have a lot of durability and energy. And this wine is kept for quite some time compared to the previous wines. So in this case, it's longer. In French oak barrels for 18 months. Therefore, it's a wine that requires a slightly different treatment, so to speak. Let's see its evolution. Well, the nose is definitely more sophisticated than the previous ones. So it is still a bit closed in the sense that it has many, many layers, so that it's made of a different texture. Sangiovese grown in Rufina, general, in terms of as more subtle scents, subtle aromas. So the more you go high up on the hills, the more these floral notes are subtle and delicate. And the more average acidity is higher, the more you go up on the hills. And this is actually a fact. Still on the palate, it is full and dense, very tense and vibrant. And there is this tension, this tannin texture. So unlike in the first wines, here we start to perceive it on the teeth. And therefore it means that this wine isn't yet at its climax, at its perfect balance. And so it is more structured than the previous ones. And of course, the oak contribution needs to be metabolized by the wine, so the wine needs time to express itself. Certainly, however, it's a wine that is much longer, lingering, more important structure, and also more angular tannins, and the acidity in the finish becomes slightly bitterish. That is another note that in Sangiovese especially in Sangiovese that gets some oak is pretty evident. So this kind of aftertaste, which is in between acidic and bitterish. And when it evolves, you can have the notes of olives and licorice, and it transforms. But this is in Sangiovese of Rufina, you often have these kind of elements. And then we can say that since Chianti is a very suitable wine, very suitable for a table, and that's a positive comment, of course. A wine that pairs beautifully with many dishes, and probably it is at its best on the table. So with these shades, because it's like a kaleidoscope of Chianti. So depending on how you look at Sangiovese, Sangiovese gives you back some information and hints and possibilities for pairings, but still always very intriguing. And as you can tell from these 7 wines, yes, there are differences. The last wine is very far from the first wine. Of course, it was different winemaking techniques, but this business card, so this identity of Sangiovese keeps coming back. And so with this body that is, always pretty slender and easy to drink. So easy to drink. So I would say that Chianti is easy to drink. And I would also associate the keyword that is acidity. So you always want more. So you are never fed up with Chianti. I mean, it's never boring, You can drink it alone, but most of all, it can be paired beautifully with Italian dishes, but also international dishes. If you have no questions, and also if you have no questions on the other side of the ocean, are there questions? Oh, yes, I see there are questions. So from Toronto. So, so you talked about temperatures, right? And 23 degrees in August, is it an average between daytime and nighttime temperatures? Yes, yes, that's the minimum average temperature. Yes, it's much warmer in August. And then from Chicago, there's another question. They're asking us whether you selected these wines specifically for this tasting. And also the glasses. Oh yes, I mean the type of glass. Oh well, we should ask the organization, but I think this was done on purpose. These look as special goblets, special glasses. So I think that this was done on purpose. I think so. And another question from Chicago for wine number 1 that we tasted. So Jesse Blecker is asking us at what altitude is the vineyard and what is its typicity. Well, the vineyard is at around 150 meters of altitude. It's Montalbano, right? Okay, let me find the slide. Yes, 150 meters. And the typicity is freshness and easy drinking. It's easy drinking, so there's a very slender body, easy to drink, and so actually this is the true strength of Chianti di Annata, of young Chianti di Annata. And I'd like to underline that when it's easy to drink a wine, I mean, this is not something trivial. That's a strength. So the more this is the case, the better the wine is made. And this is the characteristic of the first wine, besides being, as I said, floral and delicate. Yes, I would say it's a delicate wine.
My question is, what are if everything looks traditional, are there new
question is whether there are new trends in relation to Chianti.
I'm going to translate in English or speak in Italian? Do you prefer in English? Ok, se chiama in italiano per gli amici almeno capiscono tutti.
Okay, I'm going to translate the question in Italian, and then so that it can be translated into English for the foreign guests. So the question was about trends. Are there new trends? Because the lady is saying that these are very typical Chianti. Well, if I have to comment on the new trends for Chianti, and so the new typicity, I would say that the new typicity is to, so despite, of course, the regulations, etc., so the winemakers are trying to think outside the box. So, for instance, typicity in pairings, that could be a starting point. For instance, Chianti today is not only paired with Tuscany dishes like the steak or the cured meat or ribollita soup, but it's paired with any type of food, from sushi to Peruvian ceviche and other exotic dishes. So this is a very important strength because the pairing is very important, and it's also a combination of what the winemaker does and what the customer prefer. And so versatility, and so young wines, intriguing wines, compelling wines is a new trend. And another trend is the trend of organic wine and biodynamic wine, and also smaller but more and more wines without sulfites. This is a new trend also in Chianti, wines without sulfites. So we could say that it's like like a sort of movement of natural wines. So also in Chianti, this idea, this approach is ever more present. But if I have to summarize my answer related to the trends, so modern Chianti, well, we can say that modern Chianti, with these 100 million bottles, about 70-80% of Chianti made is Chianti di Annata. So because Chianti Riserva is much more limited. And therefore, the flagship wine is Chianti di Annata in terms of, market-wise. So Chianti is a very convivial wine, and therefore it has to be young, not so much for the wine, but also for the consumers of wine. So all these interpretations are intended to attract more and more a younger public that has maybe slightly different occasions for drinking, because wine is now also for the aperitif, so not only on the table, and also new pairings, not just the steaks. And so this interpretation, this approach, is the result also of the approach of new Chianti producers. Because, of course, we talked about millennia of history, but over the last 100 years, the winemakers have changed. More questions? Any other questions? Don't think so. Then I would like to thank you very much. I'd like to thank Milano.
Our friends from London, from Toronto, from New York, Chicago, and Miami.
And I'd like to thank all our
We appreciate your time.
foreign guests.
All the time with you, all the information, all our experience about Chianti. But the most important is to share. So I hope that you enjoy this experience. I hope that you are going to enjoy more and more Chianti wine. I hope they are going to pair more and more Chianti wine, either in Italy or wherever in the world.
And for our friends in Milan, I'd like to thank all the participants. I hope it was interesting, and I invite you to enjoy Chianti everywhere. Thank you. Thank you all.